Hello, Thrivers. Today I'm talking about victims of narcissistic abuse and people struggling with complex PTSD and whether or not they have a false self. Now, that phrase is kind of interesting to use when we're talking about victims of narcissistic abuse because we're used to hearing it refer to the narcissist, right? We learn that the narcissist has a false self. It's this image of who they think they are or who they need you to see them as. And in life, the narcissist is always polishing that image. Rather than working on themselves, right, who they really are, they're polishing their image. So basically narcissists they're not authentic. They're not living their life as who they really are. It's like they're living it through this false self. I'm like struggling how to say this, but what's going through my head right now is the times when I'm talking to some of my clients and I tell them that narcissists and victims of narcissistic abuse have the same core wound. And whenever I say that, people are like, what? Say that again, Michelle? What are you talking about? But the truth is that they do. They have the same core wound. A malignant narcissist normally became a narcissist because they were not accepted as who they really were. Their core self was rejected by possibly a narcissistic parent themselves, okay? The difference between the narcissist and, let's just say, the codependent, right, is that the narcissist gets that false self and lives through that false self. Whereas the codependent, I'm not going to call it a false self. I'm going to use the words of Jackson McKenzie in his book Whole Again, but he calls it the protective self. But either way, if we call it the protective self or the false self, what it is it's not your authentic self. It's the result of the wound that you've had to kind of deal with in childhood and in a time in your life when those emotions were just too strong for you. Emotional rejection for a toddler, that's like going to war, right? Because going to war means life or death. Well, being rejected as a toddler is life or death because you're being rejected by the person that is able to sustain your life. So it's the same intense emotions, and that's why people going to war wind up with PTSD, and people that were raised with parents that rejected their authentic selves, parents that manipulated and were abusive emotionally or psychologically, wind up with Cptsd. So the reality is that anyone that was raised with parents like that probably has a protective self. I say probably because, my word is not law. When I was healing on my own journey from narcissistic abuse, I remember when I first started this channel, within the first 6 months of this channel, I wrote the PDF, I Miss Me and I Want Me Back. And the reason I wrote that was because I knew that the person I was after years or decades of being around people that were narcissists, I knew that wasn't me. I had been erased. I was an erased person. Honestly, it was like I was an empty tomb. There was nothing inside. At least that's what it felt like. And I missed the person that I was, and I thought that was the real me until I realized or learned about the protective self. And when I looked at what a protective self is, I had to come to terms with, wow, the me that I missed wasn't really who I am. I mean, there were pieces of me, obviously, that were part of who I am, but it was still, I wasn't living as an authentic self. And it's not till now, it's not till breaking through all of the side effects, it's not until working through complex PTSD that I can see the difference. Now, the old me, right, that I missed was definitely an upgrade from my erased self, but again, it still wasn't my authentic self. So today, I just want to give you three signs that could help you to see if possibly you are living life through your protective self. Okay, and I'm going to be doing a lot more videos on these topics, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to give you 3 signs that you can start looking for, 3 ways that you can self-examine you. One of the first ways, and one of the most obvious ways that we can gauge if we're living life through our protective self is if we have a strong focus on the external. It could be on external things or external people. So in other words, when you think of your worth or your value, it's strongly dependent on what you have externally, what you do externally, and how people externally view you. If that is how you fuel your worth, if that is how you determine how lovable you are, if that is how you determine if you're a good person, is based on these things, then that comes from your protective self. Because remember, that core wound that creates a protective self is when your authenticity has been rejected, right? You weren't loved, accepted, and cherished for who you really are. And so, to not feel that core wound, there's a strong focus on the external to prove that you are worthy. So when you're around people, after you leave that situation, you might be thinking, what did they think of me? Do they like me? Did they judge me? Do they think I'm this or that? Or you might be evaluating your job and seeing other people's work and thinking, well, they're successful, so they're here, and look at me, I only have this and I'm like this. And so there's a real, almost, I don't want to say obsession, but a real strong focus on the external. And when you try to fuel yourself from the internal, it's almost like you can't. Like you're not able to convince yourself. Okay, the second clue, the second way you can determine if you might be living life through your protective self is if you always have this compulsion to do something or to get somewhere. Okay, in other words, if you're sitting down and enjoying something, like reading a book, right? You might suddenly think, oh, I have to do something. In order to feel productive, I have to be doing to the point of exhaustion. It's almost like you think that you have to do, but every time you do, it's never enough. And so you're constantly in this hamster wheel trying to prove that you're doing enough. That's another sign that your protective self is governing your life more than your authentic self. And the third way that you can self-examine, right? You think of like a wellness check. Once a year we go to the doctor just to make sure we're well. This is like a wellness check as far as emotionally. Okay, so you can self-examine yourself. And the third way that you can look at is looking at the patterns in your life. So in the Thriver School of Transformation, I'll leave the link here for anyone that wants to check it out. We're actually going through the book Whole Again. Okay, so that's why all of this is super fresh on my mind. But in that publication, it talks about how the protective self, it's kind of like an actor or an actress in a movie. Okay, and it's playing a role. Now, the thing is that it can stay stuck in a role. Even if it's a role that's not serving you, but it will stay stuck in that role, and you will see that taking place by the patterns that come out of your life. So some questions that you can ask yourself to see what role you might be stuck in if your protective self is having more control over your life than your authentic self. The questions are you the damsel in distress? Are you always looking to be saved and rescued? Do you keep ending up in abusive, unfulfilling relationships? Do you keep attracting narcissists or emotionally unavailable people? Even friendships? Are you constantly dating narcissists, addicts, or other selfish people? Are your days filled with endless drama and crises? Do you always help people only to end up feeling unappreciated and resentful? Are you always the giver in relationships and never the receiver or in a reciprocal relationship? Are you always unhappy or depressed? So those questions help you to see what patterns are taking place in your life. Once you know that underlying theme, you'll notice where your protective self is showing up and how it winds up keeping that theme alive. Okay? If we don't get to the heart of this, if we don't recognize this, from birth to death, you will be stuck in the same roles. You will be playing out the same cycles, the same patterns, never being able to break free. And who wants that? To me, okay, it's bad. It's bad enough to have been either raised or in long-term abusive relationships with malignant narcissists, or both, right? But what's worse is being out of those relationships and still suffering. And that often happens because we're not noticing these patterns. We're not noticing that we may be in our protective self instead of our authentic self. And if we notice that we are in our protective self, the last thing we want to do is come down hard on ourselves. We don't want to kick ourselves when we're down, or we don't want to finish the job of abusing ourselves that others started. Rather, it's about acknowledging it so that you can have compassion and start pivoting the direction of your life. Start taking control of your life so that you can live life without all these side effects of narcissistic abuse or complex PTSD. Now, I put up as much information as possible here on YouTube, but if you feel like you need more personal assistance, more one-on-one, or if you could benefit from a community of people that are on the healing journey together, make sure you check out my website. I have one-on-one coaching. I also have the Thriver School of Transformation. Both services are awesome to give you what you need so that you don't have to keep repeating cycles or patterns that are keeping you from a happy life or living the life that you should or would have lived had you not had to deal with that trauma.